The Hartley family's world collapsed on a humid August afternoon in 2001 when their 7-year-old daughter Natalie vanished from a county fair in Bend, Oregon. One moment she was clutching a cone of cotton candy, her blonde pigtails bouncing as she watched the carousel spin. The next, she was gone. David Hartley had turned away for less than 30 seconds to buy lemonade, and when he looked back, the spot where his daughter had been standing was empty. His wife, Claire, had been at a nearby booth examining handmade quilts with their older son, Tyler. The screams that followed would echo through that fairground for years to come. The initial search was immediate and massive. Volunteers flooded the fairgrounds, combing through every booth, every restroom, every parked car in the lot. Police dogs tracked Natalie's scent to the parking area before losing it completely near the western exit. Witnesses reported seeing a young girl matching her description walking with an unidentified woman toward that same area, but the descriptions were vague and contradictory. Some said the woman was older, perhaps in her 50s. Others described someone younger, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. The only consistent detail was that the girl hadn't appeared distressed. Before we continue with what happened next, if you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more of these important stories to light. The investigation consumed the Hartley family completely. David took a leave of absence from his job at the lumber mill, spending every waking hour distributing flyers and following leads that invariably led nowhere. Claire stopped sleeping, her eyes hollow and ringed with dark circles as she maintained a vigil by the phone, certain that any moment would bring news. Tyler, only 9 years old, withdrew into himself, guilt-ridden that he hadn't been watching his little sister. The family's modest 2-story home in a quiet Bend neighborhood became a command center, walls plastered with maps, timelines, and photographs of Natalie's smiling face. Months turned into years with no answers. The FBI classified Natalie's case as a suspected abduction, but without witnesses, physical evidence, or ransom demands, the trail went cold. Detective Raymond Foster, the lead investigator, never gave up entirely, but even he had to admit that as time passed, the chances of finding Natalie alive diminished to nearly nothing. The Hartley family tried to maintain normalcy for Tyler's sake, but grief had permanently altered their home's foundation. Claire started attending a support group for parents of missing children, finding solace in shared pain. David returned to work, but remained distant, perpetually distracted, always waiting for a phone call that never came. The community of Bend rallied around the Hartleys initially, organizing annual vigils and keeping Natalie's case in the local media. But as the second anniversary passed, then the third, public attention inevitably waned. New tragedies claimed headlines. Life moved forward for everyone except the Hartleys, who remained frozen in that August afternoon at the county fair. Claire kept Natalie's room exactly as it had been, her stuffed animals arranged on the bed, her favorite purple jacket still hanging in the closet. Sometimes she would sit in that room for hours, holding Natalie's favorite blanket, trying to remember the exact sound of her daughter's laugh. By 2004, 3 years after the disappearance, the family had reluctantly accepted what law enforcement gently suggested might be true. Detective Foster, his own hair considerably grayer than when the case began, sat with David and Claire in their living room one evening in October and explained the statistics. The likelihood of finding a child alive after this much time was statistically negligible. He didn't say the words "presumed dead," but they hung in the air nonetheless. Claire refused to accept it, clutching David's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white, but David felt something break inside him that night. How do you grieve someone whose body was never found? How do you have closure without confirmation? Tyler graduated middle school, then high school, carrying the weight of being that kid whose sister disappeared. He threw himself into basketball and academics, desperate to make his parents proud, to give them something positive to focus on. He rarely spoke about Natalie, but her absence shaped everything about who he became. He studied criminal justice at Oregon State University, driven by a need to understand how someone could simply vanish without a trace. During his freshman year, he volunteered with organizations dedicated to finding missing children, pouring his survivors' guilt into action. The years accumulated like layers of sediment, each one burying the hope a little deeper. By 2007, David had developed a drinking problem he tried to hide from Claire, though she knew. She had her own methods of coping, throwing herself into volunteer work at the local hospital, keeping busy enough that she didn't have to think. They attended therapy together sporadically, but talking about the wound didn't make it heal. Some losses are too profound to overcome, only to be endured. Their marriage survived, but it was different now, bound together more by shared tragedy than joy. Detective Foster retired in early 2008, handing Natalie's case file to Detective Pamela Ortega, a younger investigator who had recently transferred to the Bend Police Department from Portland. Ortega had made a name for herself working cold cases, approaching old evidence with fresh eyes and new technology. She spent her first month reviewing every document, every interview transcript, every photograph from the investigation. What struck her immediately was the sheer volume of material and the dedication of everyone involved. This hadn't been a case where corners were cut. Every possible lead had been pursued. Yet somehow Natalie Hartley had simply vanished. In March 2008, Ortega decided to revisit the original witness statements from the county fair. She noticed something that had been mentioned in several reports, but never thoroughly investigated. A woman selling homemade preserves at the fair, who had left shortly after Natalie's disappearance. The woman, identified only as Linda in the initial reports, had been selling jams under a temporary vendor permit. When investigators tried to follow up weeks later, the address on the permit turned out to be false. At the time, this had been noted but not pursued aggressively because multiple vendors had been at the fair, and there was no direct evidence linking this woman to Natalie's disappearance. Ortega began digging deeper into the vendor records, cross-referencing them with similar events in Oregon and neighboring states. She discovered a pattern. A woman matching Linda's description appeared at various fairs and markets across the Pacific Northwest between 1998 and 2001, always selling preserves or baked goods, always using different names, always providing addresses that turned out to be vacant lots or abandoned properties. Then, after August 2001, the pattern stopped abruptly. It could have been coincidence, but Ortega's instincts told her otherwise. She started making calls to law enforcement agencies in Washington, Idaho, and Northern California, asking if anyone had similar cases of children disappearing from public events where this mysterious vendor had been present. The response from Spokane, Washington, sent chills down Ortega's spine. In 1999, a 4-year-old boy named Jacob Peterson had vanished from a farmer's market. Witnesses had seen him near a preserve vendor's booth. The vendor, who had given the name Laura, disappeared immediately after. The description matched. Ortega felt the familiar rush of a case breaking open. She contacted the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, providing them with her findings. Within days, a task force was assembled to investigate what appeared to be a serial child abductor who had been operating undetected for years. The breakthrough came in June 2008 from an unexpected source. A social worker in Sacramento, California, named Monica Delgado, had been working with a troubled 15-year-old girl who had recently run away from her foster home. The girl, who called herself Ashley, had been found living on the streets and brought into the system. She was hostile, refusing to speak about her past, providing no information about her biological family. What caught Delgado's attention was a distinctive crescent-shaped scar on the girl's left forearm. When asked about it, Ashley became agitated and refused to discuss it. Standard procedure required entering the girl's information into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, including photographs and distinctive marks. The database match came back within 48 hours. The crescent scar. Natalie Hartley had a crescent-shaped scar on her left forearm from an accident with a gate latch when she was 4 years old. It was prominently featured in all the missing person reports. Delgado immediately contacted the Bend Police Department, and Ortega felt her heart pound as she reviewed the photographs. The girl's face had changed, shaped by 8 years and the harsh realities of whatever life she had lived. But the bone structure, the eyes, the way she held her mouth when she wasn't smiling, it could be Natalie. They needed DNA confirmation, but Ortega allowed herself a moment of hope she hadn't felt in months of working this case. Convincing Ashley to provide a DNA sample proved challenging. She was terrified, defensive, insisting that her name was Ashley and she didn't know anyone named Natalie Hartley. Delgado worked patiently with her, building trust over several days, explaining that the test would help them understand her true identity and reunite her with family who loved her. Finally, reluctantly, Ashley agreed. The sample was expedited to the state crime lab. DNA comparison typically took weeks, but given the circumstances and the age of the missing person case, officials prioritized the analysis. Detective Ortega called the Hartley family on July 14, 2008, 7 years and 11 months after Natalie disappeared. Claire answered the phone in the kitchen while preparing dinner, and when she heard Ortega's voice, her hands began to shake. Over the years, she had received countless calls from the police, each one raising and then crushing hope. She expected this to be another dead end, another case of mistaken identity, another reminder that her daughter was gone forever. Instead, Ortega spoke carefully, her voice measured but unable to hide the emotion beneath. "Mrs. Hartley, we may have found Natalie. The DNA test came back this morning. It's a match. Your daughter is alive." The phone slipped from Claire's hand, clattering against the tile floor. David came running from the garage where he had been working, finding his wife collapsed against the counter, sobbing. At first he thought something terrible had happened, but then Claire looked up at him with an expression he hadn't seen in nearly 8 years, joy mixed with disbelief, hope that was almost painful in its intensity. She managed to whisper the impossible words. "They found her. David, they found our baby. She's alive." Tyler, home from college for the summer, emerged from his room to find both his parents crying, holding each other, and for a moment he couldn't process what was happening. Had someone died? Then his mother turned to him and said, "Natalie, they found your sister." The reunion had to be carefully managed. Ashley, Natalie, had been living under a false identity for 8 years, raised by a woman she knew as her mother, fed a fabricated history that bore no resemblance to reality. The woman, identified as Linda Brenner, age 56, had been arrested in Sacramento after DNA confirmed Natalie's identity. Brenner had a history of psychiatric issues and had lost custody of her own daughter decades earlier. According to initial interviews, she had abducted Natalie, believing she was rescuing her, convinced through her delusions that she was meant to be the girl's mother. Brenner had drifted from place to place, homeschooling Natalie in isolation, keeping her away from situations where questions might be asked. Psychologists warned the Hartleys that the reunion would be difficult. Natalie had no memory of them. To her, they were strangers claiming to be her family. Her entire identity was built on the lies Brenner had told her. She believed her name was Ashley, that her parents had died in a car accident when she was young, that Brenner had adopted her. The trauma of discovering that everything she knew was false, combined with the shock of being separated from the only mother figure she remembered, had left her emotionally fragile and angry. The psychologists recommended gradual integration, supervised visits, extensive therapy. Claire and David agreed to everything, desperate to do whatever was necessary to bring their daughter home, but the waiting was torture. The first meeting took place in a therapy office in Sacramento, a neutral location designed to feel safe. David and Claire drove the 6 hours from Bend, bringing Tyler with them. Tyler had prepared himself for this moment for years, imagining how he would react if his sister was ever found, but nothing could have prepared him for the reality. When the door opened and a teenage girl walked in, he saw glimpses of the 7-year-old he remembered, the same blue eyes, the same way she bit her lower lip when nervous, but she was also a stranger, someone who had lived an entirely different life than the one she was supposed to have. Natalie sat across from them, arms crossed defensively, her expression closed off. Doctor. Rebecca Huang, the psychologist facilitating the meeting, spoke gently, introducing the Hartleys and explaining again why they were there. Claire couldn't stop staring at her daughter, tears streaming down her face, wanting desperately to embrace her, but understanding that she couldn't, that this girl didn't know her, might never truly know her as her mother. David's hands trembled as he held up a photograph of 7-year-old Natalie at the county fair, taken just hours before she disappeared. "This is you," he said softly. "This is the day we lost you. We've been looking for you ever since." Natalie glanced at the photograph, then looked away. "I don't remember any of that," she said, her voice flat. "Linda is my mother. You're making a mistake." Dr. Huang had warned them this would happen, that denial was a natural part of processing trauma, but hearing those words still felt like a knife. Tyler spoke up for the first time, his voice gentle. "I'm your brother. I'm Tyler. You used to make me play dolls with you, and I pretended to hate it, but I didn't really. You loved purple. Everything had to be purple. Your favorite food was macaroni and cheese, but only the kind from the box, not homemade." Something flickered in Natalie's expression, a moment of uncertainty, but it passed quickly. The sessions continued twice a week for months. Slowly, painstakingly, Dr. Huang helped Natalie process the truth of what had happened to her. They showed her newspaper articles about her disappearance, photographs of her childhood room, home videos of birthdays and holidays. They walked her through the evidence, the DNA match, the crescent scar that had been documented in medical records from before her abduction, the timeline of Brenner's movements that corresponded with her own vague memories of moving frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form friendships or connections. The moment Natalie's walls began to crack came during a session in late August 2008. Claire had brought Natalie's old blanket, the purple one with stars, that she had carried everywhere as a child. As Claire held it out, Natalie reached for it, almost unconsciously, her fingers touching the fabric. She froze. Something about the texture, the weight, the faint smell that lingered after all these years triggered a memory so visceral it couldn't be denied. She saw flashes, sitting in a living room watching cartoons, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, a kitchen with yellow walls, a backyard with a tire swing, a woman's voice singing lullabies. She looked up at Claire with wide, frightened eyes. "I remember the swing," she whispered. "There was a tree, an oak tree." That breakthrough opened the door. Over the following weeks, more memories surfaced, fragmentary and confused, but unmistakably real. Natalie remembered Tyler, remembered fighting with him over toys, remembered a dog they had owned briefly before it ran away. The memories were disconnected from her sense of self, like scenes from someone else's life. But Dr. Huang helped her understand that they were her life, her true history that Brenner had stolen from her. The process was painful, forcing Natalie to confront the reality that the woman she had called mother for 8 years was the person who had destroyed her family, who had kidnapped her and built her entire existence on lies. By November 2008, Natalie moved to a foster home in Bend, close enough for daily supervised visits with the Hartleys but separate, giving her space to process everything at her own pace. Claire wanted desperately to bring her home immediately, to make up for every lost moment, but she understood that Natalie needed autonomy, needed to choose her family rather than having them forced upon her. David threw himself into preparing for her eventual return, repainting her old bedroom in a soft lavender Natalie had said she liked, buying new furniture that fit a teenager rather than a 7-year-old. Tyler visited every day after his classes, taking Natalie to get coffee, showing her around Bend, trying to bridge the impossible gap of 8 lost years. The legal proceedings against Linda Brenner moved forward simultaneously. She was charged with kidnapping, child endangerment, and multiple counts of fraud. During the trial in early 2009, disturbing details emerged about Brenner's life and motivations. She had lost custody of her biological daughter in the 1980s due to documented mental illness and neglect. For years afterward, she had been in and out of psychiatric facilities, struggling with delusions that she was meant to be a mother, that children were being taken from her unjustly. She had attempted to abduct children before, but failed until that August afternoon at the Bend County Fair when circumstances aligned, a crowded fairground, a momentarily distracted parent, a trusting child. Brenner showed no remorse during the trial. She insisted she had saved Natalie, that she had given her a better life. She described their years together in loving terms, painting herself as a devoted mother. Natalie was called to testify, and it was one of the hardest days of her life. She had to acknowledge the truth that Brenner had kidnapped her, while also grappling with the confusing reality that Brenner had, in her own disturbed way, cared for her. Brenner had never physically abused her, had fed and clothed her, had taught her to read and write. The evil was in the foundational lie, the theft of Natalie's identity and family, but that didn't erase the complexity of Natalie's feelings. She had loved Brenner as her mother because she had known nothing else. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Brenner was sentenced to 45 years in prison without the possibility of parole. As she was led from the courtroom, she looked at Natalie one last time and mouthed, "I love you." Natalie turned away, leaning into Claire, who wrapped her arms around her daughter and held her tight. It was the first time Natalie had sought comfort from Claire instead of just accepting it, and that small gesture meant everything. Natalie officially moved back home with the Hartleys in March 2009, nearly a year after she had been found. It wasn't a magical transformation into the family they once were. That family had been destroyed the day Natalie disappeared, and what remained was 4 people trying to build something new from the fragments. Natalie struggled with anxiety and PTSD, sometimes waking at night, convinced she was back in one of the countless temporary apartments Brenner had moved them through. She attended therapy 3 times a week and slowly, incrementally, learned to trust her family again, to accept that home could be permanent, that people who loved you didn't disappear without warning. Tyler postponed his return to college for a semester to be there for his sister, and in that time they developed a new relationship built not on shared childhood memories, but on present connection. He taught her to drive, helped her study for her GED since she had never attended formal school, introduced her to his friends who accepted her without the baggage of her past. Claire learned to give Natalie space when she needed it, to read the signs when her daughter was overwhelmed and needed to retreat to her room. David found healing in the simple routines of family life, cooking dinner together, watching movies on Friday nights, helping Natalie navigate the confusing bureaucracy of reclaiming her legal identity. The community of Bend, which had mourned Natalie's loss and never forgotten her case, welcomed her return with open arms, but also respected her privacy. There were no parades or public celebrations, just quiet support, Neighbors dropping off casseroles, teachers at the local high school offering to help her prepare for college, strangers who recognized her from news coverage simply smiling and saying, "Welcome home." Natalie appreciated the warmth, but found it overwhelming at times. She had spent 8 years invisible, drifting through life without forming attachments, and suddenly she was seen by everyone, her story known, her privacy impossible to maintain. Detective Ortega visited the Hartleys 6 months after Natalie's return home, wanting to see how the family was doing beyond the official case status. She found them in the backyard on a warm September evening, Claire tending to a garden she had started that spring, David grilling hamburgers, Tyler and Natalie playing with the new dog they had adopted, a golden retriever puppy Natalie had named Copper. Ortega watched them for a moment before joining them, struck by how normal it looked, how much healing had occurred. Claire hugged her, thanking her again for never giving up, for being the one who finally brought their daughter home. Ortega felt tears in her eyes as she accepted the thanks, thinking of all the cases that didn't end this way, the families who never got their answers. That night, after Ortega had left and Tyler had returned to his apartment near campus, David and Claire sat on the porch with Natalie between them, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Natalie leaned against Claire's shoulder, something she had started doing recently, seeking physical closeness she had once found uncomfortable. "Do you think I'll ever feel completely normal?" she asked quietly. Claire kissed the top of her head. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I don't think anyone feels completely normal. We're all just doing the best we can with what life gives us." David added, "What matters is that you're here. We have a second chance, and that's more than most families in our situation ever get." Natalie enrolled at Central Oregon Community College the following January, pursuing a degree in psychology with the goal of eventually working with trauma survivors. She found purpose in her pain, wanting to use her experience to help others navigate similar darkness. She made friends slowly, cautiously, learning to trust that relationships could be lasting and real. She dated occasionally but struggled with intimacy, with letting people see the full truth of who she was and where she had come from. Her therapist reminded her that healing wasn't linear, that there would be setbacks and struggles, but that she was stronger than she knew. The years continued to pass, each one adding distance from the trauma while never erasing it entirely. Natalie changed her name legally back to Natalie Hartley, reclaiming the identity that had been stolen from her, but she kept Ashley as her middle name, not to honor Brenna's lie, but to acknowledge that the girl who had survived those 8 years was also part of who she was. She couldn't erase that experience, couldn't pretend it hadn't shaped her. Instead, she chose to integrate all the pieces of herself into something whole. By 2012, 11 years after her abduction, Natalie stood in front of a classroom at the college she now attended, giving a presentation about childhood trauma and resilience as part of her psychology degree requirements. She told her story without shame, describing the abduction, the years of manipulation, the difficult process of reclaiming her identity and rebuilding relationships with her family. She spoke about the guilt of having loved her abductor, about the confusion of reconciling who she thought she was with who she actually was, about the long, unglamorous work of healing. When she finished, the classroom was silent for a long moment before erupting in applause. After class, a young woman approached her, tears streaming down her face. "My brother was abducted when I was 8, she said. "We never found him. Hearing your story, knowing that sometimes there are happy endings, it helps. It really helps." Natalie hugged her, understanding in that moment that her survival meant something beyond her own life, that sharing her story gave hope to others still searching, still waiting for phone calls that might never come. She thought about all the families like hers, the photographs on milk cartons, the annual vigils, the desperate hope that refused to die, even when all logic suggested it should. That evening, Natalie drove to her parents' house for Sunday dinner, a tradition they had established years earlier and maintained religiously. Tyler was there with his girlfriend, and the house was filled with laughter and conversation, the easy warmth of people who loved each other deeply and had fought to stay together through impossible circumstances. As they sat around the dinner table, David raised his glass in a toast. "To family," he said simply, "to second chances, to never giving up hope." They clinked glasses, and Natalie felt a swell of gratitude so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She looked around at these people who had waited for her, who had refused to accept her loss, who had welcomed her back, even though she had been a stranger to them. She thought about the 7-year-old girl at the county fair, holding her father's hand, innocent and unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. She thought about that girl's family, destroyed by loss, somehow finding the strength to survive year after year without answers. And she thought about the woman she had become, scarred but not broken, lost but found, building a life from the fragments of 2 stolen childhoods. The crescent scar on her arm caught the light as she reached for the bowl of mashed potatoes. It was just a scar now, not the key to solving a mystery or proving an identity. It was simply part of her, like everything else. The memories she had lost, the years she couldn't reclaim, the trauma she would carry forever, and the family she had fought so hard to remember and trust. She was Natalie Hartley, daughter of David and Claire, sister of Tyler. She was also the girl who had been called Ashley, who had survived 8 years of displacement and manipulation. She was both and neither, something entirely her own. As dinner continued and conversation flowed around her, Natalie allowed herself to feel something she had struggled with for years. Peace. Not the absence of pain or the erasure of her past, but the acceptance of all she had endured and become. She was home, truly home, not just in the physical sense of being in her parents' house, but in the deeper sense of belonging, of being known and loved. The scars remained, visible and invisible, but they no longer defined her. She had been lost, and she had been found, and in the finding she had discovered not just her family but herself.